Dr. Roger Barker is the Institute of Directors' London-based Director of Policy and Corporate Governance and a former investment banker. So why has he been asked to give a talk for Biosphere Isle of Man? Are we finally acknowledging that climate change, mass extinctions and loss of habitat is connected to the lives we lead and the business models of the companies which supply our services? Dr. Barker joined me via a web link. In a former life, you were an investment banker. What's that got to do with Biosphere Isle of Man?
Well, I think, the fact that someone like me is talking about the environment, is talking about biodiversity and climate change, reflects how the world has changed, over the last 15 to 20 years. Maybe 20 years ago, the sort of people who were talking about environmental issues were a rather fringe group. Perhaps people with long beards and long hair and sandals, that type of enthusiast. But now I think concerns around these type of issues really have gone mainstream. I think everyone, or almost everyone, I think, recognizes that we need to transform the way our society works, our businesses work, to make it environmentally and climate friendly. So everyone needs to know about these things, even investment bankers, people working in the accounting profession, and directors, very importantly, the directors of companies.
And in a way, I suppose you might say that investment bankers, probably more than anybody, needs to have an understanding and it's more than an understanding, an ability to interact with this sort of global ambition to address climate change. I think sometimes that there's an assumption that government is there and government will solve all the problems, but quite frankly, governments do not have the resource needed to change all this round, do they?
No, I think we really need a partnership between all aspects of society to address these problems. Individuals, the decisions they're making about how they heat their homes, what they buy in terms of what they eat, the everyday decision making, that plays a key role. Business plays a key role. Finance plays a very important role because finance determines, where resources are allocated, what type of activities are invested in. And all of that needs to change in much more of an environmentally friendly direction.
And then in terms of your role at the moment, you're at the Institute of Directors, you're the Director of Policy and Corporate Governance and member of the Management Board there. Presumably, you do an awful lot more of discussion and talk about how what the environmental impact is than perhaps you would have ever done, maybe even as recently as 5 years ago.
Yeah, yes, I do think there has been a sea change, just even in the last 5 years. People, I think, were a bit worried, perhaps, when the pandemic hit, that the growing awareness and prioritization of climate change and the environment was going to be pushed off the pedestal. But that simply hasn't happened. It looks like there has been a long-term shift in attitudes in all corners of society. And we see this in the surveys that we do with IOD members. IOD members are business leaders, but they're citizens just like everyone else, and they have the same concerns and the same worries about the impact that modern business and fossil fuels and modern society is having on the environment, and they want to do something about it. Although often they're often not sure where to start. That's been another, I suppose, bit of feedback that we've received from our members.
And of course, this is part of the problem as well, isn't it? Everyone now, pretty much everyone, is signed up to the idea that we need to do something about this. But having absolute clarity as to what any particular business can and should do is maybe less certain. Understanding that by putting a whole load of photovoltaic cells on your roof, will have a particular impact, but then there may be another associated cost with it. And trying to actually get your head round all of this as a business and understanding, sometimes I think businesses leap into doing something because something is better than nothing, and it's quite difficult to understand the environmental impacts of everything that you do.
I think that's right. I think it is quite confusing actually for business and at the moment. You know, there are lots of standards, there are lots of best practices out there. Um, we're still at quite, I think, an immature stage in terms of our development as an economy from a sustainability point of view. I think that will change over time. I mean, certainly the one of the IUD's jobs, I think, is to help our members address these issues. But in the next year or two, I think we're going to have things like uh, new accounting standards and ways of reporting, which are going to be defined by regulators. Something which in the past has been done on a voluntary basis, but which will now become mainstream into the economy. And I think as this develops, it will become easier. But at the moment, it is, I think, quite tricky. And yeah, we've just got to help directors, help business leaders through this morass of different information that's out there.
And I suppose the other risk associated with all this is that we are so busy measuring how unsuccessful we are in meeting all the various objectives that we're not actually getting on with doing the real work of reducing climate change, reducing carbon emissions, etc., etc.
Yes, although I do think measurement is very important. There is a saying that what isn't measured doesn't get managed. And I think there is some truth in that. I mean, of course, measurement is only the beginning, and we have to use that information to actually, develop action plans, targets, and drive real change. Um, but it is important nonetheless, though, to try and quantify. For a small firm to just start by quantifying their existing carbon footprints. What sort of an impact are they currently having? Because that's the baseline that they then can use to develop plans for the future, targets for the future, and can measure their performance again. So it's data does matter.
Indeed. So you've been asked to give a lecture by Biosphere Isle of Man, and that's to take place on Wednesday the 25th. And I suppose it would be interesting perhaps to have a bit of an understanding. I mean, obviously don't give all the secrets away, but what sort of things are you going to be discussing in that lecture?
Yes, I'm going to be looking at where we currently stand in terms of climate change, and also, making the point that business is keen to really play its part in addressing this unique societal challenge. Then I'm going to go on to say that I think there are kind of three key building blocks which we need to address if actually this is all going to happen. And I'm going to talk about the need for green incentives, so that it actually becomes commercially beneficial for companies to do the right thing, to act in a green way. And that is often not always the case out there for many businesses. And that, I think, will need a partnership between government and between and business to work out how we can kind of incentivize the economy to move more in a green direction.
And what
Um,
sort of things, what sort of incentives do you think are going to be most effective?
Well, I think if we think back on some of the things that have been done in the past that really have worked well, probably the first one that comes to mind was just the simple act of government requiring people to pay for a plastic bag, 5 pence for a plastic bag back in 2015. the result of that was a 97% decline in the use of single-use plastic bags. So, that was an incredibly effective way of creating an incentive to do the right thing. And another example, I think, was when um, the UK government kick-started the whole offshore wind industry by providing quite targeted subsidies for that industry and a way for that industry to kind of connect into the grid electricity system of the UK, which was incredibly successful. So for the future, something that the IOD is proposing is that companies that achieve net zero and can accredit the fact that they have achieved net zero should be able to benefit from a lower rate of corporation tax compared to other companies. So, providing a real commercial incentive for companies to plan a route to net zero. And I think, there are many other initiatives and ideas out there which point in this same direction. Don't make it difficult for companies to do the right thing. Incentivize them to do the right thing, and that I think is a key building block.
And of course, ultimately, the goal is that the economy provides the incentives, because actually this is what people choose to do, and the polluting alternative is considered to be not acceptable anymore. So they would want to use these things.
Yes, I think to some extent it's a combination of different factors. So part of it, of course, is people's changing attitudes, and that I think we're seeing develop hugely. As you say, simply this feeling that we as citizens, as consumers, as employees, as bosses, we want to do the right thing, and there's almost like a norm of behaviour develops in society to make decisions with climate change and the environment in mind. But I think also you do need to combine those kind of changing attitudes with the change in the way that the market system, the economy works, so that there is actually a financial incentive as well to do the right thing. Because human beings are motivated by different things. So some have very strong ethical principles, and that's what drives their behaviour. Others are more driven by financial factors, and we also need to appeal to that group of people as well.
And actually, a really good example of that on the island in terms of financial incentives driving people's behaviours was back in, was it 2008, when there were particularly high oil prices, and we have around 40,000 homes on the island, and something in the region of 700 to 800 homes fitted wood-burning stoves that particular year, because wood at the time was relatively cheap to buy, and the oil and gas that was heating their homes was very expensive. It is about making the greener alternative cheaper and more attractive, really, to the consumer, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and this is, I think, something which we're going to be facing in a pretty short period of time. Issues like, how do we make the transition to away from the main source of domestic heating in the UK, which is gas-fired boilers, towards a more environmentally heating system, and that, of course, is going to cost money, and we haven't really sorted out, who's going to pay for this, how is it going to be financed, and a similar kind of transition is going to be taking place with respect to vehicles. The transition from fossil fuel driven vehicles to electric vehicles. How are we going to make sure that transition is completed? We've got to give the right incentives. That will, I think, require a big role for government as well as a big role for business.
Because effectively, what we are likely to see is we have the conventional world that we're used to now, and in hopefully 20 years' time, we will have a different version of the world, which is much less polluting and much more sustainable. The hard bit is always moving from the one to the other, because you have to retain, in effect, two different systems. You have all the logic and knowledge that goes with the former system, and moving everyone, the whole of society, from one thing that they are very familiar with to something that they are unfamiliar with, which may actually be much better for them. It may be cheaper, less polluting, but actually getting that change is the difficult bit, and that is where government really needs to step in, isn't it, to provide some forms of incentive.
Yes, and we shouldn't underestimate this. The sort of transformation which we're looking for is really unprecedented, almost in human history. I think
Mm.
we're asking society and the economy to shift from an economy that was fundamentally based on fossil fuel energy sources, and which in its economic transactions, didn't take account of the externalities that business or anyone else was imposing on the environment, and wider society. They weren't part of the cost calculations that you make when you calculate whether you've made a profit or loss. So we're shifting from that society to something completely new. But I think what we don't want to do is sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think that it is possible to make a market economy work in a better way, in an environmentally friendly way. We don't need to sort of go to something radically different. But even if we're adjusting the nature of our market economy, it's still a huge shift.
And that is going to take some very experienced or knowledgeable directors of companies to be able to actually make that shift. And I think you mentioned earlier to me that's one of the second planks of the discussion that you're hoping to have on Wednesday evening.
That's right. Green governance, in other words, and that, as in any organisation, it's the board of directors that is in charge of governance. And I mean, first and foremost, it's going to need the right people sitting around the boardroom table at each of our organisations. Are those people? Do those people have the right skills, the right knowledge? Do they understand how to actually think about sustainability issues when they're having their strategic discussions, and build them into the decision making process? And it does require, I think, new skills and new knowledge. I mean, how many directors really understand, the difference between scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions? Which is a big part of the kind of anatomy of when you discuss greenhouse gas emissions. Do they understand those concepts and how they can apply them to their organisations? And so it does require some new skills, and perhaps slightly different types of people sitting on boards compared with the usual suspects that we've had in the past, who've primarily been finance people or people from a more traditional general management background.
Because, of course, there is so much information out there as well, isn't there, that some of it entirely legitimate and good. In fact, most of it, I would imagine, is. Other information is willfully placed in our homes through social media and the like, to try and discourage us from moving on this particular green journey. And part of the role of directors is trying to fathom the vast amount of information and try and understand which bits are most relevant to us.
Yes, no, absolutely. But on the other hand, though, I think incorporating sustainability into your governance is ultimately, it isn't rocket science. It involves some quite kind of very logical steps, namely, understanding what the carbon footprint is of your organization, developing a plan to actually reduce emissions and move to a net zero situation, defining targets, interim targets and long-term targets to achieve that, and putting in place the people and the structures to monitor progress, and also to report and disclose how you're doing to the outside world, to stakeholders, so that people continue to trust your organisation. So those are those key steps. I think are pretty clear and are applied by boards in many other areas. But now it's time to apply them to sustainability.
Well, sadly, we are drawing towards the end of the programme now. I suppose the obvious question that I would ask is, are you confident that we are capable of meeting the exacting requirements of moving towards a more sustainable future? And I suppose the other question, being capable is one thing. Are we actually going to do it?
Yeah, I don't think we can take it for granted, because there are there are major obstacles, and including the fact that a lot of policymakers work on quite a short-term timescale. Given the way the electoral cycle works, and what we really need here are policymakers and businesses that plan for the long term and put in place a consistent strategy which is really followed. But I suppose I'm more optimistic than ever, given just the general societal consensus around the need to address climate change. And of course, the other factor, which unfortunately is going to become all too apparent in the near term, are the negative implications of a warming climate. The extremes in temperature, adverse weather events, and so on, which we saw last year, and these are just going to continue and accelerate. So that will be an ever-present reminder of the need to do something. So I think I would say I'm cautiously optimistic, but I don't think we can take anything for granted.
And I suppose the final question, is it first trip to the Isle of Man, or have you been over before?
No, I have been over on a couple of previous occasions, both times to visit the IOD branch on the island, and it's always impressed me what an active and engaged branch the Isle of Man has. The IOD on the Isle of Man seems to be a real hub for directors and business people, and so I'm really looking forward to catching up with people once again.
And if, and it's a horrible thing to ask someone to do in a minute, but what would be the top things that you would suggest that businesses need to do to properly embrace what's going to be needed here to move to this more sustainable future?
Yeah, so I think it would be think about, have you got the right skills within your organization to think about sustainability? Work out a plan for how you're going to get to net zero. Start by measuring your carbon footprint for a baseline year. Then work out targets and a timeline for how you're going to make progress. Involve the entire organization in trying to achieve that, and make sure that everything you discuss around the boardroom table takes it into account, and communicate with the outside world in terms of what your plans are and how you're doing, and encourage other organizations to follow your example.
Well, I'm sure with this interview ringing in their ears, people will be inspired to come along and listen to the lecture, and I'm sure everyone is looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Dr. Barker's lecture takes place at the Manx Museum this Wednesday, the 25th of January at 7 p.m, but you need to book via Eventbrite tomorrow at the latest. Let me know your thoughts and views on the programme by contacting Phil Gorn at manxradio.com. For now, though, I'm Phil Gorn. Goramayo. Thanks for listening.